Before we begin, this video is presented in the form of an audio documentary. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, put on your headphones and step into the story. Imagine you live in a port city. It's October 1347. The harbor is busy, it's always busy. Ships come and go from everywhere. Constantinople, Alexandria, the Crimea, the eastern edges of a trade world that has been growing for a century. Commerce is the blood of this city, and ships are how it flows. One morning, 12 ships arrive from the Black Sea and dock at the port of Messina in Sicily. They've come a long way. The sailors aboard should be exhausted but relieved. Instead, when the harbor workers approach the vessels, most of the men they find on deck are dead. And the ones who are still alive, the ones clinging to ropes and rails and the edges of the hulls, are covered in black swellings the size of eggs. The swellings ooze blood and pus. Their skin is mottled with dark spots. They're burning with fever. They are vomiting without stopping. And the smell coming off those ships is something no one on the docks has ever experienced before. The port authorities order the ships out of the harbor immediately. Turn around. Leave. Go back to wherever you came from. But it was already too late. Within days, people in Messina started getting sick. Within weeks, the city was unrecognizable. And within months, what arrived on those 12 ships had spread across the entire island of Sicily, then up into mainland Italy, then into France, Spain, and England, and then across the whole of Europe, killing somewhere between a third and half of the entire population of the continent. No one alive today has ever seen anything like it. No modern pandemic, not the Spanish flu, not COVID-19, not any outbreak in the last century, comes close to what happened between 1347 and 1353. In 6 years, Europe lost more people than it would take centuries to replace. Entire villages disappeared. Cities that had taken 100 years to build were emptied in months. The world that existed before 1347 would never exist again. But here is the thing that most people don't understand about the Black Death. It wasn't just a disease. It wasn't just mass death. What happened between those years was a total collapse of medicine, of government, of religion, of the social order, of everything ordinary people had been taught to believe about how the world worked. And what came after was so different from what existed before that historians still argue about whether the Black Death ended one era of human history and began another. This is that story. Not from the perspective of kings or popes or generals. From the perspective of the people who lived through it. The farmers and merchants and priests and doctors and mothers and children, who woke up one morning in a world that still made sense and went to sleep in a world that had started to end. To understand what the Black Death actually was, you have to go back further than 1347. Much further. The story doesn't begin in Europe. It begins somewhere in the grasslands of Central Asia, probably in the region around modern-day Kyrgyzstan, possibly as far east as China. Scientists who have analyzed ancient DNA from plague burial sites in that area now believe they've found the origin point. A population of bacteria called Yersinia pestis that lived in the fleas that fed on the rodents of the Eurasian steppe. For centuries, possibly millennia, this bacteria existed in what epidemiologists call a reservoir, a population of animals where a disease lives and circulates without causing catastrophic outbreaks. The marmots and ground squirrels of Central Asia carried this disease. The fleas that lived on them carried it. And because marmots and squirrels don't travel far, and because the humans who lived near them knew to be careful around sick animals, the disease mostly stayed where it was. But then something changed. Exactly what triggered the explosion in the 1330s and 1340s is still debated. Some historians point to climate disruption, a series of droughts and cold snaps that pushed rodent populations together in ways that allowed the disease to amplify. Others point to the expansion of the Mongol trade empire, which created roads and networks and connections across the entire Eurasian landmass that had never existed before. Probably it was both. Probably it was a combination of factors that converged at the worst possible moment. What we know is that by the early 1340s, outbreaks were already occurring in Central Asia and China. Medieval Chinese records describe enormous population die-offs. Chroniclers along the Silk Road wrote about towns being emptied, about trade caravans arriving to find silence. And then the disease moved west, carried along the trading networks that connected the east to the Mediterranean. By 1346 it had reached the Black Sea coast, the Crimea, the trading ports where Genoese merchants from Italy had their warehouses and their colonies. The Mongol ruler of the region, Khan Janibeg, was besieging the Genoese city of Caffa when his army was struck by the plague. According to a Genoese notary named Gabriele de Musis, one of the few people who actually wrote down what he witnessed, the dying Mongol soldiers were catapulted over the walls of the city. Whether this is literally true is debated. What is not debated is that the plague reached Caffa, and the Genoese merchants in Caffa, fleeing what was already becoming a catastrophe, boarded ships and sailed for home. They stopped at Constantinople. They stopped at Messina. They stopped at Genoa and Venice and Marseille. Everywhere they stopped, they left something behind. The people in Sicily in October 1347 did not know what they were looking at. They had no word for this. The term Black Death wouldn't be coined until centuries later. What people called it in the moment was simply the pestilence, or the Great Mortality, or sometimes just the plague. The word plague in medieval Latin simply means blow or wound. A strike from the outside, something that hit you. And what it did to you when it hit you was unlike almost anything medicine had ever described. There were several forms of the disease, and they behaved differently enough that people who witnessed them sometimes didn't realize they were related. The most common was what we now call bubonic plague. It starts with the flea bite, usually on the leg or arm or somewhere near the skin. Within days, the nearest lymph node begins to swell. In the groin, in the armpit, in the neck. The swelling grows into what medieval witnesses called a bubo, a lump the size of a chicken egg, sometimes as large as an apple. It was tender and hot and painful enough that people described victims writhing in agony just from the pressure of it. The fever came quickly. A fever so high that chroniclers described delirious patients who didn't recognize their own families. Violent headaches, aching in every joint, vomiting. Then the skin would begin to show black and purple blotches, hemorrhages beneath the surface, blood vessels rupturing as the bacteria overwhelmed the body's defenses. This is where the Black Death came from, though the name wouldn't be used for centuries. In the 14th century, people just saw people going black. Without modern antibiotics, bubonic plague killed somewhere between 30 and 70% of the people it infected, depending on conditions. That's already catastrophic by any standard. But there were two other forms. Pneumonic plague infected the lungs. It spread not through fleas but through the air, through coughing and breathing. It was faster and more lethal than bubonic plague. In its pneumonic form, the disease could kill within 24 to 48 hours of first symptoms. People went to bed feeling slightly unwell and were dead by morning. Contemporary accounts describe victims coughing blood, struggling to breathe, turning blue. The death rate from pneumonic plague without treatment is close to 100%. And then there was septicemic plague, the rarest and most bizarre form. In septicemic plague, the bacteria entered the bloodstream so rapidly, and in such overwhelming numbers that the immune system had no time to respond. The person died before any bubo had time to form. They could die within hours of the first symptom. Some accounts describe people going to sleep healthy and never waking up. Medieval witnesses who saw this, a person apparently fine at dinner and dead in the morning, had no framework to understand it. It must have felt like something supernatural. Here is what made all of this so devastating. Medieval Europe had no idea what caused disease, no way to detect a pathogen, no antibiotics, no vaccines, no public health infrastructure in any modern sense, and no shared understanding of contagion that was accurate enough to have helped them stop it. They were, in the most profound way possible, completely defenseless. The world that the plague arrived in was not a world in collapse. This is important to understand because sometimes the Black Death is taught as though it arrived in a Europe already weakened and tottering. That's not quite right. The Europe of the 1340s was, by medieval standards, a civilization near its peak. The population had grown enormously over the previous 2 centuries. In 1100, Europe probably had around 35 to 40 million people. By 1300, that number had roughly doubled to between 70 and 80 million. Towns had grown into cities. Trade networks had expanded across the continent and beyond. The great cathedrals were being finished. Universities were functioning. The wool trade and the grain trade and the spice trade were all connecting places that a century earlier had barely known each other existed. But this prosperity had limits. The population had grown so much that by the early 1300s, Europe was probably at or near its agricultural carrying capacity. Most farmland was already under cultivation. Food was available, but there wasn't a huge buffer. A bad harvest in one region could cause famine locally. And famines had happened. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had killed millions across northern Europe when a series of catastrophically wet summers destroyed crops for years in a row. People had survived. The system had held. But the margin was thin. And then the plague arrived in this thin-margin world. In this world where a disruption of even moderate scale could cascade into something far worse. And it didn't disrupt things at the margins. It hit the center. The first Italian cities to be struck, Messina, Catania, then Genoa, Venice, Pisa, Florence, were among the most sophisticated and populous urban centers in Europe. Venice and Florence weren't just big cities. They were the financial capitals of the Western world. The wool and banking industries of Florence connected to every corner of Europe. The shipping lanes of Venice connected Europe to the entire Mediterranean. These weren't backwater villages. These were the nodes of the entire European economy. And they started dying in the winter of 1347 and through the spring of 1348. The chronicles written by people who were actually there are some of the most extraordinary documents in human history. Giovanni Villani was a Florentine merchant and chronicler who had been writing a detailed history of the city for decades. He began writing entries about the plague, describing what he saw, trying to record it for posterity. His entries become increasingly urgent, increasingly disturbed. Then in 1348 they stop. He died of the plague while writing his chronicle. His brother Matteo picked up where he left off, opening his continuation with the words, "I am not able to put down how terrible this pestilence is." Another Florentine, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio, survived and left one of the most vivid first-hand accounts ever written of what the city looked like. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, a collection of stories supposedly told by 10 young nobles who fled Florence to a country villa to escape the plague. But his introduction, his description of Florence in 1348, is not fiction. It is one of the most devastating pieces of documentary writing in any language from the medieval period. He wrote about bodies lying in the streets. He wrote about neighbors refusing to help neighbors. He wrote about houses standing open and empty, property abandoned, the sick dying without anyone to hold their hand. He wrote about the total collapse of social norms, about people abandoning their elderly parents, about parents abandoning their own children. He wrote about the gravediggers who couldn't keep up, who piled bodies into pits and covered them with earth and went back for more. He wrote about the smell. Florence in 1348 probably lost between half and two-thirds of its population. A city of perhaps 90,000 to 100,000 people was reduced, by the time the plague passed, to somewhere around 40,000 or 50,000. And those numbers, staggering as they are, were not unusual. They were typical. Here is something that the statistics fail to capture: the way people experience time during the plague. Normal time has a rhythm. Seasons, harvests, festivals, market days, the structure of the week around Sunday Mass, the structure of the year around the agricultural calendar and the church calendar. People knew roughly what tomorrow would look like, because yesterday had given them a pattern. Life was hard often, but it was legible. You could read it. During the plague, time broke. A merchant named Agnolo di Tura, writing from Siena in 1348, described what happened in his city with a flatness that is almost more disturbing than emotion would have been. He wrote that the plague began in May and killed every day through July and August. He wrote that many dropped dead on the streets. He wrote that he buried 5 of his children with his own hands. Not "my children were buried." With his own hands, because there was no one else. Siena was a city in the middle of an ambitious civic project in 1348. The Cathedral of Siena, one of the great Gothic cathedrals of Italy, was being expanded. The plans were extraordinary. The nave that existed would become just one transept of an enormous new structure that would have dwarfed any cathedral in the world. Work was proceeding. Marble was being cut. Money was flowing. And then the plague came and the workers died and the money evaporated and construction stopped. And it never started again. The cathedral still stands today with a massive unfinished nave alongside it, walls that were never completed, arches that were never roofed, columns that reached toward a ceiling that was never built. The Black Death frozen in stone. That image, a civilization interrupted mid-sentence, mid-movement, mid-breath, is what you find everywhere you look in the 14th century. In England, the plague arrived in June 1348, entering through the port of Weymouth on the south coast. It moved north through Dorset and into Bristol, which was one of the most important ports in England. The chronicler of a monastery in Bristol wrote that the living were scarce able to bury the dead. From Bristol it moved in multiple directions, east toward London, north toward Wales and Yorkshire. London, by the summer of 1348, was already receiving reports from the south. The King of England, Edward III, moved his court away from the city. Parliament, which had been scheduled to meet in January 1349, was postponed. Edward wrote that a plague of deadly pestilence has broken out in the places near the said Parliament, and daily increases in severity, and through the contagion of this pestilence, those coming to the said Parliament from the places in question would risk death. Parliament postponed due to a pandemic. There is something strange and familiar about reading that sentence from nearly 700 years ago. London lost perhaps a third to a half of its population in the winter and spring of 1349. The bodies overwhelmed the existing church graveyards almost immediately. New burial grounds had to be established outside the city walls. Smithfield, which you might know today as a market district, was one of the sites where mass graves were dug. Historical estimates suggest that in some of these mass burial sites, the graves were dug in layers, one level of bodies, then a thin layer of earth, then another level of bodies. Contemporary accounts from all over England describe the same progression. A village is fine. Then one person falls ill. Then several. Then the churchyard fills up. Then there's no priest left to say last rites because the priest is dead too. Then there's no Lord Steward to record the deaths because the steward is dead. Then the records simply stop. And in the gap where the records used to be, you find the true shape of what happened. What did people think was causing this? This is one of the most important questions you can ask about the Black Death, because the answers reveal everything about how medieval people understood the world, and why they were so utterly unable to stop what was happening. In October 1348, a group of professors at the University of Paris medical faculty were asked by King Philip VI of France to provide an official explanation for the plague. This was the most prestigious medical institution in Europe. These were the best educated men in the continent, the people most qualified to answer this question. Their report still exists. They concluded that the plague was caused by a great pestilence in the air that had originated with a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the 40th degree of Aquarius on March 20, 1345. The three planets together, they explained, had drawn up water vapors from the earth and corrupted the air. This corrupt air, which they called miasma, was being breathed in by people, and it was making them sick. This was not fringe thinking. This was mainstream science. The miasma theory of disease, the idea that bad air caused illness, was the dominant framework for understanding epidemic disease across the entire medieval world, in Europe, in the Islamic world, everywhere. It had its roots in ancient Greek medicine, specifically in the work of Hippocrates and Galen. It had been refined and elaborated over centuries. It was, by the standards of 1348, the state of the art. And it was completely wrong. The implications of this wrongness were catastrophic. If you believe disease is caused by bad air, then your disease prevention strategies are going to be about avoiding bad air. Light fires to purify the air. Burn incense. Don't breathe deeply. Avoid low-lying ground near rivers, where the miasma is worst. Carry herbs and flowers under your nose. These measures were everywhere during the plague. People walking through infected streets holding bunches of flowers, physicians examining sick patients while wearing beak-shaped masks stuffed with aromatic herbs. None of it helped. There was a minority view, expressed by some observers, that the disease seemed to spread from person to person. The plague seemed to follow people. It traveled along trade routes. It jumped from households to neighbors. It killed whole families in sequence, one after another. Some of this was noticed. Some people drew conclusions from it. But the evidence was hard to interpret without germ theory. Yes, the disease seemed to spread person to person, but so did miasma, in a way. People in the same household breathed the same air. People in the same neighborhood were exposed to the same atmospheric conditions. The observations could fit either theory. And the theory that had the weight of Aristotle and Galen and 8 centuries of medical tradition behind it was the miasma theory. So doctors prescribed purges and bleeding and dietary changes and relocation and fragrant herbs. None of it helped. Surgeons who were brave enough or desperate enough sometimes lanced the buboes. This was excruciating and not based on any correct understanding of what was happening, but in some cases it may have actually helped a little, by releasing some of the accumulated pressure and allowing the body more time to fight the infection. It was the right action arrived at through the completely wrong reasoning. Some people ran. This was probably the most effective intervention available, and it worked, but only if you ran early enough before you were already infected, and only if you went somewhere that the plague hadn't yet reached. The wealthy had this option. The poor did not. You can see this in the death rates. Across medieval Europe, the plague was more likely to kill urban dwellers than rural ones, more likely to kill the poor than the rich, more likely to kill those who had no choice but to stay. This is not because rich people were smarter. It's because rich people could afford to leave. While physicians debated miasma and noblemen fled to their country estates, the church was trying to make sense of what God was doing. Because in the medieval world, God was the answer to almost every question about the natural world. Plague, famine, earthquake, flood. These were not random events. They were expressions of divine will. The theology was quite explicit. God sent suffering as punishment for sin. The worse the suffering, the greater the sin that had provoked it. Repentance and prayer and penance were the appropriate responses, and they would eventually bring the suffering to an end. This framework had worked tolerably well through smaller catastrophes. You could make the math work. A flood here. A bad harvest there. People sinned, God punished, people repented, God relented. The cycle was comprehensible. But the Black Death did not fit the cycle. The prayers went up and the plague continued. The masses were said and the churches filled with corpses. The penitents flagellated themselves in public processions, literally whipping their own flesh to demonstrate remorse, and the death toll kept rising. God did not relent. For many people, this was the most disturbing thing about the entire catastrophe, more disturbing in a way than the bodies themselves. Because if God sends suffering as punishment, and this level of suffering could be visited on an entire continent, what did that say about humanity's sin? What could possibly have been done to deserve this? Some people concluded that the end of the world had arrived. The book of Revelation had described plagues and suffering as signs of the approaching apocalypse. What else could this be? The mathematical calculations ran. If 1/3 of the people around you were dead within a year, and this was continuing, and there was no sign of it stopping, the rational conclusion was that it wasn't going to stop. That this was the end. Some people responded to this conclusion by throwing away the rules. If the world was ending, why not eat and drink and fornicate? If God was going to kill everyone, why maintain the social order? Contemporary chronicles describe a breakdown of behavioral norms in plague-struck cities. Drinking, debauchery, theft from dead neighbors' houses, the abandonment of normal decencies. Some of this is probably exaggerated by the moralistic chroniclers who recorded it. But some of it is probably true. Apocalyptic logic produces apocalyptic behavior. Others responded with intensified piety. More prayer, more fasting, more self-denial, more giving to the poor. More mass. More confession. More desperate appeals to the Virgin and the saints. And some, a significant and terrifying some, responded by looking for someone to blame. The persecution of Jews during the Black Death is one of the darkest chapters in medieval European history, and possibly in the history of anti-Semitism more broadly. Within months of the plague's arrival, rumors began circulating that had caused it. The specific accusation was that Jews were poisoning the wells, that they had deliberately introduced some substance into the water supply in order to kill Christians. This accusation had no basis in any evidence. It was pure fabrication. But it spread across Europe with something approaching the speed of the plague itself. The first major massacre occurred in Toulon, France in April 1348. In quick succession, massacres followed in Narbonne, Carcassonne, and other towns in southern France. By the summer of 1348, the violence had spread into the Holy Roman Empire, into the German-speaking territories where most of Europe's Jewish population was concentrated. In Strasbourg in February 1349, the city council initially refused to accept that Jews had caused the plague. There was no evidence, and Strasbourg hadn't even been badly hit yet. So the guilds and the local citizenry overthrew the city council, installed new leaders who would give them what they wanted, and then proceeded to murder approximately 2,000 Jews. Those who agreed to baptism were spared. Those who refused were burned alive on a wooden platform in the Jewish cemetery. The scene in Strasbourg was repeated with variations across the German territories throughout 1349. Basel, Freiburg, Augsburg, Cologne, Frankfurt. Hundreds of Jewish communities were destroyed. Some communities were locked in their synagogues, which were then set on fire. Some people were thrown into bonfires in the town square. In Mainz, the Jewish community apparently fought back. Contemporary accounts describe them mounting a defense before being overwhelmed. Pope Clement VI, who at this point was residing in Avignon and had more direct experience with the plague than most, issued 2 papal bulls condemning the massacres and pointing out, quite correctly, that the Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as Christians, which rather undermined the theory that they were causing it. He also noted that the plague was occurring in places that had no Jews at all. How were they poisoning wells in regions where they didn't live? These were reasonable arguments. They had no effect. The massacres continued. In some places, the townspeople killed Jews before the plague had even arrived, in preemptive prevention of an attack that was entirely imaginary. The psychological logic, if it deserves to be called that, was comprehensible if not excusable. In a world where disease was supernatural punishment, where invisible forces were killing your family and you had no way to fight them, the idea that there was a human agent behind it, that you could identify an enemy, name them, punish them, and thereby stop the killing, offered something that real medicine and real theology could not offer: control. The illusion of agency in the face of total helplessness. It was wrong. It was murderous. And it destroyed communities that had been part of European civilization for centuries, leaving scars that have never fully healed. By the late spring and early summer of 1349, the plague was moving into England's north, into Scandinavia, and across the Holy Roman Empire. It was also, by this point, beginning to wane in some places where it had struck hardest. Florence and Venice and the Italian cities that had been hit earliest were starting to see fewer new cases. The bodies were still being buried, but the pace was slowing. But it didn't stop. It just moved. And as it moved, it killed different kinds of people in different ways. It hit the clergy especially hard, because priests and monks and friars were the people most likely to be in contact with the sick and dying. They were the ones administering last rites, hearing final confessions, performing burials. Their professional duty placed them at the center of the dying, and they died at staggering rates. This had consequences beyond the obvious tragedy of the deaths themselves. The church was not just a religious institution in medieval Europe. It was an educational institution, a medical institution, a welfare institution, a legal institution, a record-keeping institution. The monasteries were where books were copied and stored. The cathedrals were where disputes were settled. The parish priests were often the only literate people in a village. When the clergy died, something more than religion died with them. In many dioceses, the plague killed so many priests that bishops had to dramatically lower the standards for ordination, just to have enough clergy to perform the basic functions. People who would never normally have been considered for holy orders were ordained in emergency circumstances. The intellectual and moral quality of the church's personnel, which was already a subject of criticism before the plague, declined sharply in the aftermath. And the people who survived, the lay people who had watched their priests die, who had watched their prayers go unanswered, who had watched the church seem to fail them at the moment of maximum need, they remembered. The seeds of a skepticism about clerical authority, about the church as an institution, about the entire theological framework that had been supposed to protect them, were planted in the plague years. They would take generations to fully grow. But they grew. Meanwhile, the plague was doing something else at the same time, something that would turn out to have extraordinary long-term consequences. It was killing workers. Medieval Europe was an agricultural economy, and that economy ran on labor. Specifically, it ran on the labor of peasants, serfs and villeins and cottagers, and all the gradations of unfree and semi-free workers who were bound to the land of their lords. These people owed labor services to the lords who owned the manors where they lived. They worked the lords' fields in exchange for the right to farm their own strips. They couldn't move without permission. They couldn't marry without permission. They were, for all practical purposes, property. The plague killed them in enormous numbers. And this created a problem that no one in the feudal hierarchy had anticipated. Dead serfs don't farm. And when you've lost a third of your agricultural workforce in a single year, The land can't produce what it used to produce. Crops rotted in fields because there was no one to harvest them. Animals wandered unattended. Entire manors that had been productively farmed for generations sat empty, returning slowly to scrub. But here is the twist that no one in the aristocracy wanted to face. The serfs who survived knew their situation had changed. Before the plague, labor was abundant and land was relatively scarce. There were always more workers than there were positions. This kept wages low and gave lords all the leverage. A serf who wanted better conditions couldn't easily threaten to leave, because where would they go? The next manor would have the same conditions. After the plague, everything inverted. Labor was suddenly scarce. Land was abundant. There was far more land than there were hands to work it. A surviving serf standing in a landscape where half the neighbors were dead could look around and see abandoned manors, desperate lords, and a world that suddenly needed him more than he needed it. Wages began to rise. Not because anyone intended to raise them, but because lords competing for the few surviving workers had to offer better terms. And surviving serfs who now had options they had never had before started negotiating. Started walking off manors and going to the next village where conditions were better. Started demanding payment in cash rather than in labor services. Started behaving, in short, like workers in a tight labor market. The aristocracy panicked. In England, the government of Edward III responded in 1349 with the Ordinance of Labourers, later strengthened as the Statute of Labourers in 1351. These laws were explicit. Wages were to be fixed at pre-plague levels. Workers were prohibited from demanding higher wages. Workers were prohibited from leaving their lords. Employers were prohibited from paying more than the legal maximum. Violations were punishable by imprisonment. Similar laws were passed across Europe. The ruling class was trying to use legislation to undo the economic consequences of the plague. It didn't work. You cannot legislate away the laws of supply and demand, and medieval governments did not have the administrative machinery to enforce these statutes everywhere, all the time, against millions of people whose entire material incentive was to evade them. Workers continued to move. Wages continued to rise, in some regions doubling or tripling over the course of a generation. The old certainties of the feudal world, the arrangements that had kept the peasantry in place for centuries, were cracking. In England, the crack became a fracture in 1381, when the peasants' revolt brought an army of common people to the gates of London, killed the Archbishop of Canterbury, and forced the young Richard II to personally meet with the rebel leader Wat Tyler. The revolt was eventually suppressed and many of its were executed. But it demonstrated something that the ruling class could no longer entirely ignore. The world that had existed before 1347 was gone. While the labor force was restructuring itself and the aristocracy was trying to hold back a social tide with legal instruments, medicine was going through its own crisis. The doctors had failed. Not for lack of trying. Not for lack of courage. There were physicians who stayed in plague-struck cities when they could have fled, who examined dying patients when they could have refused, who wrote accounts of what they observed with a detail and care that testifies to real intellectual seriousness. They failed because they were working within a theoretical framework that was not just inadequate but was pointing them in the wrong direction. The most telling evidence of this failure is in the survival statistics for the medical profession. Doctors in plague-struck cities died at higher rates than the general population. They were in contact with the sick constantly. They were examining buboes. They were in rooms full of people in the final stages of pneumonic plague coughing blood. They had protective gear, the beak masks, the waxed robes, but none of it was designed with any knowledge of how the disease was actually transmitted. It was designed to filter out bad air. It did not filter out fleas. It did not create distance from respiratory droplets. The doctors knew they were failing. The best of them said so in their writings. Guy de Chauliac, one of the most eminent physicians of the 14th century and a personal physician to Pope Clement VI in Avignon, wrote that the plague was shameful to medicine, because medicine had nothing effective to offer. He wrote about the terror of treating patients, the helplessness of watching them die, the inadequacy of everything he knew. He survived the plague, which he attributed to being lucky with his bloodletting schedule, though the real reason was probably that he was moderately careful about contact with the infectious, and that his body mounted a successful immune response. The failure of medicine during the Black Death did not immediately demolish the authority of doctors. medical authority is resilient. It survived the plague much as the Church's authority survived it, battered, questioned but still standing. But questions were being asked. And those questions, about why the learned men had failed so completely, about whether the ancient authorities that medieval medicine deferred to were actually reliable, about whether systematic observation might be more valuable than inherited doctrine, were the questions that would, eventually, lead to the development of modern medicine. The Renaissance, which began gathering momentum in Italy in the later 14th and 15th centuries, was partly powered by exactly this skeptical impulse. If Galen was wrong about plague, was he wrong about other things? If Aristotle was wrong about causation, what else was wrong? The careful empiricism of Renaissance science, the observation, the experiment, the willingness to revise a theory in light of new evidence, was not caused by the Black Death. But the Black Death cracked the authority of the ancient texts in a way that made that empiricism easier to arrive at. There is a place in Italy called the Camposanto Monumentale, the monumental cemetery of Pisa. It was built in the 12th century, and its walls are covered with some of the most remarkable paintings in medieval Europe. Among them is a fresco that art historians believe was painted shortly after the Black Death. It is called the Triumph of Death. In the fresco, a group of noble riders on horseback come across 3 open coffins in the road. The coffins contain corpses in various stages of decomposition. The riders cover their noses. They are genteel people confronted with the reality of death, and they are trying to look away. Meanwhile, in the sky above, angels and demons are. The painting is usually dated to about 1340, possibly slightly earlier, which would make it a product of the world just before the plague, not after. But its subject matter, the ubiquity of death, the futility of looking away, the democratic impartiality of mortality, is so perfectly aligned with what the plague made visible that it feels prescient, as though someone somehow saw what was coming. The image of death was everywhere in the visual culture of the later medieval period, and this too was a consequence of the plague. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became one of the most popular artistic and literary motifs of the late 14th and 15th centuries. In these images and texts, death appears as a skeletal figure and leads people of every class and station in a procession. The pope, the emperor, the knight, the merchant, the peasant, the infant, all dancing together toward the grave. The point was always the same. No rank, no wealth, no piety protects you. You will dance with death eventually. Before the plague, death was certainly present in medieval art and religion. The church was full of images of crucifixion and martyrdom, and the torments of hell. Death was never absent from the medieval mind. But after the plague, death became different. More immediate. More personal. More physically specific. The corpses in post-plague art are detailed. You can see the worms, the decomposition, the specific physical reality of a body that was alive and is now not. There is a quality of confrontation in this art, as though the artists who made it had seen too many dead bodies to be abstract about mortality anymore. The great historian Johann Huizinga, writing in the early 20th century, called the late medieval period the autumn of the Middle Ages, and he was describing exactly this quality. A culture that had looked death in the face so many times that death had become not just a theological event but an aesthetic one. A subject of endless fascination and horror, and almost fetishistic attention. The Black Death didn't only kill bodies. It changed the way the survivors thought about their own lives, their own mortality, the relationship between the brief time they had and the eternity that awaited. It introduced a quality of impermanence into everything, a sense that anything at any moment could be taken away. There are moments in the plague years that resist easy framing, that don't fit neatly into either the narrative of horror or the narrative of heroism that historians sometimes reach for. Consider the flagellants. The movement began in Germany and spread rapidly across the Holy Roman Empire and into France and the Low Countries in 1349. Groups of men, sometimes hundreds of them at a time, would travel from town to town performing acts of public penance. They wore white robes with red crosses. They processed through the streets twice a day singing hymns. And then they would gather in the marketplace or the churchyard and they would flagellate themselves, with leather straps tipped with iron spikes, until they bled. The theology behind this was the same theology that motivated everyone. If the plague was punishment for sin, and ordinary prayer and fasting hadn't worked, then perhaps a more extreme demonstration of remorse was needed. The flagellants were, in their own minds, trying to appease God by showing him the seriousness of their contrition. They were volunteering to suffer so that God might be satisfied and end the dying. The crowds that received them were enormous. People came from miles around to watch. They threw themselves in the road to be stepped on by the flagellants. They collected the blood that fell from the self-inflicted wounds as holy relics. The movement had the quality of a mass religious hysteria, the collective energy of people who had been terrified and helpless for months and who were finally doing something. Moving, acting, bleeding, not just waiting to die. The church, initially tolerant, became alarmed. The flagellants were preaching outside the formal church structure. Some of their leaders were developing theological ideas that were not entirely orthodox, ideas about self-mortification, about whether absolution from a priest was even necessary if you had bled enough. They were also, in a number of places, participating in or inciting violence against Jews. Pope Clement VI condemned the movement in October 1349 and ordered it suppressed. The movement's momentum broke relatively quickly after that, though its ideas would surface again in later decades. What stays with you about the flagellants is not the self-harm but the desperation underneath it. These were people doing the only thing they could think of to do. In a world where plague was supernatural and medicine had failed and prayer had produced nothing visible, the act of bleeding publicly, of demonstrating your willingness to suffer, at least had the quality of an action. It was something. And when you are watching everyone you know die and you are completely powerless, something can feel like everything. In the Islamic world, the plague arrived along the same trade routes and through the same maritime connections that brought it to Europe, just from a different direction. It struck Egypt in 1347 or early 1348, spreading from Alexandria south along the Nile and east into the Levant and Anatolia. The Islamic theological response was different from the Christian one in important ways. Islamic scholars, drawing on the Hadith, the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, had a more developed tradition of thinking about plague. The Prophet was reported to have said, "If you hear of an outbreak of plague in a land, do not enter it. But if the plague breaks out in a place while you are in it, do not leave that place." This was, in essence, a remarkably practical piece of quarantine advice that anticipated, at least intuitively, the logic of contagion containment. The Islamic tradition also framed plague death as martyrdom. Dying from plague was understood as dying in the path of God, and therefore a potentially honorable death rather than a purely shameful one. This framing made confronting death somewhat easier, at least theologically. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveler, passed through the Middle East during the plague years and recorded what he saw with characteristic clarity. He noted the enormous death tolls, the crowded cemeteries, the silence of streets that had been busy before. In Damascus, he reported people processed through the streets barefoot, carrying copies of the Quran, a mass penitential procession that was officially organized by the authorities as a response to the crisis. The great Arab historian and scholar Ibn Khaldun lost his parents to the plague in Tunis in 1349. He was 17 years old. Decades later, in his monumental work The Muqaddimah, widely considered one of the founding texts of historiography and sociology, he wrote about the plague as a civilizational rupture. Civilization both in the East and the West was visited by a destructive plague which devastated nations and caused populations to vanish. What he was doing in that sentence was something new. He was framing the plague not just as a divine punishment or a natural disaster but as a historical cause, as something that changed the pattern of civilization, that bent the arc of history. This was a recognizably modern way of thinking about catastrophe. It is not coincidental that one of the first people to think in these terms was someone who had lost his family to the plague before he was grown. In the years after the first wave of the plague, people began to hope that it was over. The dying had slowed. The streets were beginning to function again in a reduced way, with the people who remained. Commerce was resuming at lower volumes. Fields were being farmed, by fewer hands for higher wages. The church was holding services again, though with fewer clergy than before. And then in 1361 the plague returned. The second wave is sometimes called the Pestis Secunda, and it killed at rates comparable to the first, though the total death toll was lower because there were fewer people to begin with. What made this wave particularly devastating from a demographic perspective was its preference for young people, the children born after 1347, who had no immunity because they had not been exposed to the first wave. The second wave was known in some countries as the children's plague. Contemporaries watched an entire generation die. The plague returned again in the 1370s, and again in the 1380s, and again roughly every decade for the better part of a century. Each outbreak killed some portion of the population that had been rebuilding itself since the last one. Europe could not get ahead of the mortality. Every generation of new children was exposed before it grew up. The population of Europe, which had been around 75 million in 1340, was probably around 45 to 50 million by 1400, and still declining or stagnant in many regions. It is not until the late 15th century, in most of Western Europe, that population levels begin to recover. It is not until the 16th century that some regions approach pre-plague numbers. That is more than 150 years of sustained demographic loss and stagnation. More than 6 generations of living with the plague as a constant background threat. Think about what that does to a civilization. 6 generations of people who grow up knowing that the plague comes back. Who build that knowledge into their lives, their prayers, their planning, their emotional investments. Who learn not to expect that children will survive to adulthood, not to plan too far ahead, not to assume that anything will still exist in the form it has today. The historian David Herlihy wrote that the Black Death fundamentally changed the psychology of European civilization, that it introduced a kind of structural anxiety, a permanent undercurrent of awareness of mortality and impermanence, that was qualitatively different from the anxiety that existed before. Whether you can truly measure the psychology of an entire civilization is debatable. But the cultural artifacts of the late medieval period, the art, the literature, the religious practices, the obsession with death, do have a quality to them that it is hard to explain without the plague. There is one dimension of the Black Death that is almost never discussed in popular history, and it is perhaps the most important of all, what the plague did to the internal logic of the medieval world system. Medieval European society was, at its foundation, a hierarchical system built on specific ideas about why things were the way they were. God had arranged society in a certain order for specific reasons. The king was king because God had ordained it. The lord was lord for the same reason. The peasant was a peasant, and the serf was a serf because God had placed them there. This was not just political theory, it was theology. The social order was the divine order. This framework had significant work to do. It had to explain why some people had power and wealth and others had nothing. It had to make those with nothing accept their position as proper and divinely sanctioned. And for centuries it mostly worked, not perfectly, not without conflict, but the basic ideological structure held. The plague attacked this structure at its foundations. If God's order was right and proper, why was God killing the righteous alongside the wicked? Why was the pious priest dying in his church while the faithless merchant fled to his country house and survived? Why were children, who had committed no sins, dying at the same rate as adults? Why were whole communities of devout Christians wiped out while some communities of Jews, who the church taught were living outside God's grace, survived? None of this fit the theological model. And the economic disruption cut the same way. If the serf was a serf because God had ordained it, why did God's plague now make the serf worth more than the Lord? Why was the surviving laborer now in a position to demand wages that his grandfather could never have imagined? The traditional answer, that social position reflects divine will, was being contradicted by the daily economic reality that everyone could see. It would be too simple to say that the Black Death caused the Reformation or caused the Renaissance or caused the end of serfdom or caused the rise of capitalism. Historical causation doesn't work that cleanly. But the plague ruptured, in a way that nothing else had quite managed, the taken-for-grantedness of the medieval worldview. It made things that had seemed natural and permanent seem contingent and temporary. It produced survivors who were, in measurable ways, more skeptical than their predecessors, more willing to question authority, more interested in this life than the next, more concerned with practical results than with doctrinal correctness. John Wycliffe, the English theologian who first challenged papal authority in the 1370s and began the intellectual project that would eventually lead to the Protestant Reformation, had grown up in plague-stricken England. So had his followers, the Lollards. The generation that produced Wycliffe was the generation that had watched the church fail to stop the plague, fail to explain the plague, and continue to demand tithes and deference even as it failed. Jan Hus, who took Wycliffe's ideas to Bohemia in the early 15th century and was burned at the stake for them, was of the same generation in the same post-plague world. And Martin Luther, who finally cracked the church's monopoly on Christian interpretation in 1517, was the product of a German society that had been living with plague as a recurrent trauma for nearly 2 centuries. You cannot draw a straight line from the Black Death to the Reformation, but you can trace the logic. In a world where the most powerful religious institution in Western civilization had faced its greatest test and failed, the question, does this institution speak for God, was significantly easier to ask than it had been in 1346. The word quarantine comes from this period. It comes from the Italian word quarantina, 40 days. In 1377, the city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, on the Adriatic coast formally instituted a policy requiring all ships and travelers arriving from plague-affected areas to wait for 30 days, later extended to 40, before being allowed to enter the city. Venice, which had already been instituting informal isolation measures since the first wave in 1347, formalized its own quarantine system around the same time. This was, by medieval standards, a remarkable piece of public health policy. It was not based on a correct understanding of germ theory. Quarantine was motivated partly by miasma thinking, and partly by the intuition that whatever caused the disease was connected to the bodies and goods of the sick. But it worked. Cities and ports that rigorously enforced quarantine suffered lower mortality than those that didn't. Ragusa also established in 1423 the first permanent quarantine station, a designated island in the harbor, called the Lazaretto, where suspected plague cases and their contacts were held in isolation. This became the model for quarantine stations across the Mediterranean and eventually the entire world. The word Lazaretto, derived from the name of Saint Lazarus, patron of lepers, was used for these isolation facilities for centuries. The epidemiological logic of quarantine was sound, even if the people who invented it couldn't have explained why in modern terms. Separate the potentially infected from the healthy. Wait long enough for the disease to manifest or not. If it doesn't manifest, release. If it does, treat in isolation. The insight that you could interrupt the spread of disease through spatial separation and temporal delay was one of the most important medical insights of the medieval period, and it was arrived at not by academic theorizing but by practical observation of what did and didn't seem to reduce transmission. This is worth noticing. The people who developed quarantine were merchants and port administrators, not physicians. They were people whose economic interests gave them a strong incentive to keep death out of their harbors. They were empiricists without a theory. They didn't know why quarantine worked, but they could see that it seemed to, and that was enough for them to institutionalize it. The physicians, meanwhile, were still arguing about planetary conjunctions. By the 1380s and 1390s, in the parts of Europe that had been hit earliest and hardest, there was a strange quality to life that doesn't have an easy name. It was not recovery exactly. Recovery implies a return to something, and there was no going back to what had existed in 1346. But it was also not simple devastation. It was something more complicated. The construction of a new normal in the shadow of an ongoing threat. People were getting married again. Children were being born. Farms that had been abandoned were being reclaimed and worked again, though often by different families than had worked them before. Towns that had lost half their populations were slowly refilling, from the surrounding countryside, from regions that had been less devastated, from natural population growth. The trades were functioning again with different configurations. The guilds that had dominated urban economies before the plague had been disrupted by mass death, and now had to adapt to new conditions. Apprenticeship systems were strained. There weren't enough experienced masters to train the next generation. Wages remained high by pre-plague standards. Conditions for the surviving working class were, paradoxically, better than they had been in 1346. Not good. Medieval life for most people remained hard, short, and uncertain, but better. In the country, the long process of what historians call the transition from serfdom was underway. Across England and France and the Low Countries, serfs and villeins were converting their labor obligations to cash payments. Some were buying their freedom outright. The lord-serf relationship that had structured rural Europe for centuries was being renegotiated from the bottom up by people who now had enough leverage to demand better terms. This process was slow and contested and violent in places. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. The Jacquerie in France in 1358. Peasant uprisings and labor disputes across the continent. The ruling class did not give up its advantages without a fight. But the direction of movement was clear, and it was moving against the old order. The plague had not democratized Europe, Medieval society remained hierarchical, unequal, cruel. The nobility still held enormous power. The church still dominated intellectual and cultural life. Women remained subordinate in ways that would not begin to change for centuries. None of the fundamental inequalities of medieval society were erased by the plague. But the plague had made the future possible. By killing so many people and disrupting the economic relationships that had kept so many others in place, it had created space, actual physical and economic space, for new arrangements to emerge. Not immediately, not cleanly, but over the century and a half that followed, the space the plague created was where the Renaissance grew. Florence in 1400 was not Florence in 1340, but in some ways it was more Florence than it had ever been. The city had lost perhaps half its population. The great banking families had been shaken. Some houses had failed entirely in the disruption. The wool trade had contracted. The guilds had changed. The social structure was different. And yet Florence in 1400 was producing art and writing and architecture and political thought at a rate and quality that had no equivalent in European history before it. Petrarch, who is often called the first Renaissance humanist, and who was a young man during the first wave of the plague, wrote obsessively about the experience of living in a transformed world. He lost friends, colleagues, and people he loved to the plague. He wrote about the strangeness of surviving when so many had not, about the obligation of the living to remember the dead, about the responsibility of a generation to make something of the time it had been given. This sensibility, this acute awareness of time, of the preciousness of life, of the obligation to leave something behind that would outlast you, is everywhere in the early Renaissance. It is in the civic humanism of Florence, in the idea that the good city requires the active engagement of its citizens. It is in the portraiture that begins to proliferate in the 15th century, the individual human face recorded in paint made permanent. It is in the biographies and autobiographies that begin to appear, the idea that a single life is worth recording in detail. The Black Death did not cause humanism, but it created conditions in which humanism could thrive. In a world where you have learned that everything can be taken away at any moment, the things you choose to make permanent acquire extraordinary weight. It did not end cleanly. That has to be said. The last major outbreak of bubonic plague in Western Europe was in Marseille in 1720, more than 350 years after the first wave. In between, the plague returned and returned and returned. It came to London in 1665, in the outbreak recorded by Samuel Pepys in his diary and memorialized by Daniel Defoe in a journal of the plague year. It came to Amsterdam and Hamburg and Danzig. It was never gone for very long. It was just occasionally temporarily absent. What ended the plague in Western Europe was not medical knowledge. Effective antibiotic treatment for Yersinia pestis was not available until the 20th century. What ended the plague, or rather what ended the major epidemic episodes, was a combination of factors that historians still debate. Better nutrition among a less densely crowded population, changes in the rat populations and their flea communities, improved housing that reduced rat-human contact, possibly changes in the strain of the bacteria itself, possibly the development of some degree of genetic resistance in human populations that had been exposed for generations. The people who lived through the later outbreaks did not know that plague would eventually go away. They didn't know that the children of their grandchildren would live in a world where this particular terror was no longer present. They just kept living in the world as they found it, getting up in the morning, farming the fields, trading the goods, praying in the churches, burying the dead, with the knowledge that the plague might come back, had come back before, and would probably come back again. This is perhaps the most human thing about the entire history. Not the heroism or the horror or the theological confusion or the economic upheaval or any of the large historical forces that we can track from a distance of centuries, but the ordinary persistence of ordinary people, who kept going even when they had no reason to believe that keeping going would end well, who raised children knowing that the plague might take them, who planted crops knowing that the harvest might come to a dead city, who fell in love and built houses and learned trades and went on pilgrimage and wrote books and composed music in the years between outbreaks, in the spaces that death left. The world that emerged from the Black Death was not a better world exactly. It was a more anxious world. A world that knew things about mortality and contingency, and the limits of human understanding that the world before 1347 had not been forced to fully confront. But it was also, in strange ways, a more dynamic world. A world where the old certainties had been cracked open. Where questions that had previously been unthinkable were now being asked. Where the authority of the past was somewhat weaker and the experience of the present was somewhat stronger. Whether that is gain or loss is a question that depends on what you think the purpose of a civilization is. Whether it is better to live in a world of stable certainties that may be wrong, or in a world of productive uncertainties that may be right. The survivors of the Black Death didn't get to choose. They just inherited the world the plague left behind, and they made what they could of it. There are things we know about the Black Death with reasonable confidence. We know roughly how many people died. We know how the disease spread. We know the broad outlines of the social and economic and religious consequences. We know the timeline. We know the geography. But there are things we do not know and may never know. We do not know what it felt like to be standing at the edge of a mass grave in 1349 looking at the faces of people you knew. We do not know the precise quality of the fear that moved through a market town when the first reports arrived from the south. We do not know what the survivors felt in the years afterward, when they tried to explain to their children what the world had been like before, what it had looked like, what it had meant, what had been lost. What we can say is that the Black Death was not the end of the story. It felt like the end of the story to many people for many years. It felt apocalyptic in the original sense of the word, a revelation and uncovering, a moment when the fabric of ordinary reality was pulled back to reveal something terrible underneath. But the story continued. The fields were replanted. The houses were rebuilt. The children were born. The books were written. The trade routes reopened. The cities slowly recovered their populations and their ambitions. And out of the transformed, shaken, humbled, and strangely energized civilization that the Black Death left behind came some of the greatest art and science and political thought in Western history. The plague did not make Europe better, but it made Europe different. And out of that difference, out of that fracturing of the old certainties, out of the space created by 50 million empty graves, came a world that was capable, eventually, of asking questions that the world of 1346 had never thought to ask. Whether that is an adequate return for 50 million dead is not a question that history can answer. It is a question that it simply holds open, the way that unfinished cathedral in Siena holds open its broken arches against a Tuscan sky, stopped mid-motion, frozen in the moment when the money ran out and the workers died and the future ceased briefly to be imaginable, and then continued anyway.